Okay, good morning, we are back. And we have Ira Mathur with us this morning. And we are going to talk with her about matters related to journalism, the press, the media, as president of the Media Association of Trinidad and Tobago. It's a very important organization because of the role of the press, the role of the media in society. And as the president, she gets the opportunity not only to think about what's happening in the media and the press and in journalism, but to act on some of these matters. So, Ira, I want to welcome you very warmly to this brighter morning with Bo, and I'm very glad that you are on and we'll get a chance to have a conversation. So good morning to you and thank you for coming on.
Good morning, Bo. It's my pleasure. We haven't had an interview for a long time, and it's interesting being on this end of the interviewing table with you. Good morning. Lovely to be here.
Good morning. Now, I'm going to start with a simple question that people might want to ask, which is, what is it like being the new president of MAT? And what kinds of issues are occupying the attention of your organization at this time?
Well, it's been a very interesting time as well as a tough time because, of course, we're operating during a pandemic. MAT has operated for 35 years, but the pandemic is new. When I came into this organization in October, we inherited a very, very strong institution. The previous executive continued to do great work as watchdogs, especially in the area of legislation, Bo. This executive has come in with a mandate of catapulting MAT and our members into the digital age. As you may imagine, our challenges are similar to challenges everywhere, including navigating the pandemic for frontline media workers such as ours, but more importantly as well, battling misinformation, carving out a separate space from influencers. And we are continually trying to do that. We've grown our membership from about 30 to over 150 members and associate members. And we are hoping that this cross-fertilization between the generations and cross-platforms will create some kind of fermentation that will hone and deepen our media. And of course, one of the major challenges we're currently facing is due to the COVID restrictions, media have kind of been locked into that between the balance of understanding the need for safety and, of course, our important job of upholding the fourth estate.
Has that affected the quality of the work that comes out in the media or in journalism, or the effectiveness of reporting and scrutiny of what is happening in the society? Because you mentioned the issue of watchdog and, you mentioned digital age, but I'll leave that for a minute. Has it hampered you, is what I'm after really, in bringing the news to the population and creating the conditions in which you can have access and opportunity to fully report during this pandemic period?
Well, we've definitely had some major challenges operating in the pandemic. I mean, on the second day that we came in, we wrote to the speaker asking for pool photographer to be allowed access into the parliament. We've had challenges with getting greater access to information regarding COVID. We've had most recently the big challenge was, as you must have read, is that media workers were locked out of the proceedings in Tobago when there was a kind of change, when there was a change in governance and officials were being sworn in. So yes, it has been a challenge, and what I'd like to say is that journalists are also citizens, right? And this brings me to another point about about being a journalist during COVID is that the irony is that the very journalists covering the stories of people suffering from the fallout of COVID-19 or holding public officials to account are also victims of health and economic challenges. And this is where Matt also is trying to take our membership to uplift them, to ensure that we are there to support them.
Okay, I understand your perspective, and I understand the challenge is very real. You mentioned the thing in Tobago, you mentioned Parliament and the issue of access. Now, we've had some very interesting developments within recent times. For instance, the Prime Minister called on Newsday last week to apologize for a story he claimed was entirely false. That had to do with the fact that he had met with PNM officials in Tobago and it had been a stormy session and reported as being abusive. The opposition leader called on her MPs some weeks ago to boycott CNC3 because they hired a former PNM candidate as a TV show host. There was a strong Express editorial on the matter you raised, which accused Her Excellency the President of shutting out the media from the inauguration ceremony of the Tobago House of Assembly. And there have been other accusations of bias of individual reporters and of general media bias from time to time. But that happens in a society, you know. Media is often accused of that. Is the media doing something wrong, or is the media doing something right that is getting the media, first of all, into trouble, and more than that, and that forces the media to kind of advocate in the interests of freedom of access and press freedom?
Okay, Bo, that's a very, very interesting question. So let's take the first two to start with, right? The question of the Prime Minister calling on Newsday to apologize for a story and the opposition leader calling on her MP to boycott CNC3. Matt continues to keep a very strong eye on these stories. But I want to make it really clear, and I think the public really needs to know this, is that the response to specific complaints against media houses, right, falls under the ambit of the Media Complaints Council, which is an independent body set up by the TTPBA, which is the Trinidad and Tobago Publishers and Broadcasters Association. This Media Complaints Council is charged with enforcing a code of practice framed by the TTPBA and ratified by the Media Complaints Council. So I'll just give you a general idea of how it works. All media members, according to this council, must maintain the highest professional standards, among them accuracy. All media practitioners should take care not to publish or broadcast inaccurate, misleading, or distorted material. Two, whenever it's recognized that a significant inaccuracy or misleading statement or distorted report has been published, it should be corrected promptly and with due prominence. An apology should be published whenever appropriate. All media organizations should always report fairly and accurately the outcome of an action for defamation to which it has been a party, and media are also given an opportunity to reply to inaccuracies. So it is the responsibility of editors to cooperate as swiftly as possible in MCC inquiries. So that's kind of outside the MAT ambit. The reply in 7 days should be the norm. And, all members of the TTPBA have undertaken to publish or broadcast in full any adjudication that comes out of this. Regarding your third point of the strong Express editorial, that directly feeds into access and the ability to do our job. So that fits into our job to uphold the Fourth Estate and to ensure that we have the access to do really what is the people's work. It's a pillar of democracy. We mirror the country. So Matt wrote to the president's house when we realized the situation was happening. We realized early on Friday morning from 7 o'clock, one of Matt's members alerted us to the fact that our photographers were not given entry into what was then into the hall of the Magdalena where the swearing-in process was taking place. By 9:30, we wrote to the president's house to express our concern over those dramatic limitations. And as we said in the letter, and you may have read it, that we acknowledge the need for restrictions related to COVID-19. And we invited the president and her team of professionals to be inventive in their approach to balancing the need for safety with the public's need to be informed, particularly at an event that marked a significant change in the status quo of Tobago's governance. So that was where we intervened, and that was where we were really glad to see that the Express wrote that editorial. Personally, I was really appalled that our colleagues were outside. They were sitting in the sun. There was no arrangements made for them, and to me, I think that that was wrong at so many levels. And we are continuing to do some investigations regarding that, and we realize that just the band-aid of a letter here and there does not work. So we have planned to speak to the TTPBA on representing journalists in a stronger way so that we have more access. And I think, Bo, as a journalist, I know that we are expected to do our jobs no matter what the conditions are, but there's a slight contempt with which we have been treated over the years by public officials. So there's that contempt in the way we've been treated. There's a slight carelessness in how we've been treated, and although there has, by no means has the media in Trinidad and Tobago been crushed or subdued in any way, and that's more to our credit than to the way that we are often treated by public officials.
Yeah, I find, is it that politicians and people in high office, you cannot call Her Excellency the president a politician because she's supposed to be above that. But generally, politicians and others in high office, do you think that they want the press to report what they say, but they do not want the press to subject them to any hard questions or to put them under scrutiny? Do you think that this is a general tendency by people in high office and people in high positions and people in political life?
Absolutely. Is that most people, including politicians, don't actually understand what journalists do. We are the watchdogs, we are the voice of the people, we are the mirror of the people, and we are a very important pillar of democracy. And despite the way we are treated, I would go as far as to say journalists watch over all the instruments and institutions of democracy, so that when a politician or somebody in public office agrees to an interview with us, I think often they think that that interview is about making them look good. And many people don't understand the difference between public relations and scrutiny. And that is why when an interview is done, it's written, the research is done, and all the context is done, and the journalist presents that story in the newspaper, people are often shocked, thinking, oh, but I really liked that person. I thought they liked me. But in fact, our first allegiance is to our work, and our work is to, in the most transparent way possible, to reveal to the public, to be a mirror to exactly what we can bring as closely as possible to what is the truth from a position of objectivity. And I guess people in, especially in democracies like ours, right, with the Westminster system, where it does tend to be top heavy and people do tend to kowtow to people in office. It's always a shock when a journalist comes and says, you may be the prime minister, you may be, you may be the leader of the opposition, you may be a senator, you may be a very important person in your own right. But we are bringing you under scrutiny, not because I, Ira Mathur, or any other reporter wants to ask you or humiliate you or bring you in under any undue pressure, but because it is the work of the people.
Yeah, I mean, I sense that there's a trend like that, which is that people want to get their views across, but they are not prepared to answer serious questions or probing questions about what they are saying, and they are not prepared to subject themselves to a situation where they have to answer questions on the spot. And that is an important part of the journalistic enterprise and the journalistic purpose, which is to create the conditions in which people are able to account on the basis of their knowledge and information and perspective, and to be able to answer once questioned right away. Do you think journalists fall into the trap of partiality? That is to say, they might like a person or a politician or a public figure, and they would in fact become a kind of public relations agent for that person, almost without that intention, but by the manner in which they write. And more than that, do you think that there can be journalists with biases in which they have a certain view of the person, and no matter what the person says, they would write the story they want anyway? I mean, is that a possibility in the media?
Of course, that's a possibility, Bo. I mean, journalists are citizens, journalists are people, and journalists are voters, right? If you look abroad, whether you look at Fox News, there's been a long tradition of journalists following certain political, political guidelines, going across certain. You look at the Sun in the UK, and that's clearly extremely right wing. You look at the Guardian, you're going to get the very liberal view. The difference between newspapers in I guess bigger countries is that they declare their ideology fairly upfront, right? You read the Financial Times, you absolutely know that you're going to get a very, very conservative point of view. Over here, because our media that much smaller, and it's more like a village, right? 1.4 million people, certain amount of people who interact constantly. That line is slightly more blurred, but I would still say that yes, it does happen from time to time, and it is regrettable. But I think that although journalists who sometimes do display a kind of bias, without explicitly declaring their interests, I think because this is such a small place, people kind of know where they're coming from. And remember too that there's different types of journalism. So if you've got the commentator, they have a right to say what they want. If you've got a feature writer, they have a right to give you that bit of color, the surrounding circumstances. But when it comes to news, I'm happy to report that actually you have to fall within certain stringent guidelines of how to write a news story, which is you quote your source, and then you try to get a counter source, and so both sides are covered. So that is where some of the checks and balances do come in. But I would say that is more the exception in Trinidad and Tobago rather than the rule. But of course, it does happen, Will.
All right, so we can't take a blanket view of, let's say, a newspaper or a television station or a media company then. We have to look at a couple of things, which is the way news is reported. Secondly, the way people express free opinions in the media, and that could be from any perspective. And thirdly, the editorial stance of the newspaper or the institution on matters that are important. So that kind of distinction has to be made, no?
Absolutely, both. All those distinctions have to be made. I suppose people who I recently had a discussion with a few people who said, why is it that every day it's bad news in the papers? We pick up the papers and we see how many people died from COVID. We see how terrible the crime is. Why don't you just report on the good news? And that made me realize all over again that actually we need a huge education drive in the country in terms of what journalists do. And part of our job is not just to report the news, but when we report the news, we are also become very active agents of change. Because if you're a watchdog and you're continually watching to see what people in positions of power and people who can be agents of change are doing, and you're holding them into account, it's not great news. It's really the business of the people, and it's a very important business and pillar of democracy. So yes, there's different ways of covering the news. There's a commentator, there's the op-ed, there's the feature writer, and there's a news story, and there's blurred lines in between, and none of it is public relations. We are not here to make people feel good and give them public relations. We are here to strengthen the democracy and to ensure that when the people of this country speak, they speak with an informed voice. And Bo, you know this more than me probably. This country, I have never seen democracy at work so both amazingly and infuriatingly in this country. Almost everybody, especially now with social media, has a voice. Everybody says very loudly what they think. And so there's no question of censorship. I think that robust response from the people, a very democratic and robust response, where we are not just held to account by within one another, we are held to account by the people. So that if I come across as fraudulent or pushing an agenda, I am going to be picked up in 2 seconds by the population, and similarly all my colleagues. So we are very aware of that.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Sorry, I didn't get the last thing. What did you say?
I was just saying that that's a very good thing, because our reading and listening population is extremely discerning, and people do tend to read the papers, cover to cover.
So you would say that the democratic spirit in Trinidad and Tobago is strong, and
yes,
that basically the media and the media houses and the press elements of media, that they are independent and strive for independence and assertion of institutional independence.
I would absolutely say so, Bo. And I think that in the times that we've been scuppered, it has to do with more to do with the fact that we've got opaque public systems where we haven't had access to information as we ought to have. A huge peeve of a lot of journalists is that our statistics is just so poor. So that if we want to pull out some statistics on almost every aspect of public life, sadly, what we often do is we go to America, or we look at global statistics, right? Because for some reason, our statistics in terms of, whether you look at how families are coping during COVID, or you look at economic statistics, how is the pie being sliced, or we look at statistics of oil and gas, or you look at almost or poverty, we always have to look at international statistics. And that small, what appears to be an admin issue, holds us back. That and somehow the opacity of public figures, who can kind of very easily shut you out. Those are the two things that I think that we suffer from. The other thing is that the very journalists, like I said before, and especially now, covering the stories of people suffering from the fallout of COVID-19, and also the huge economic fallout, right, are victims of health and economic challenges. And again, just like I said to you, we have to go to studies abroad, like a recent study conducted by the International Federation of Journalists on global journalism in the current COVID-19 era last year. They polled about 1,300 frontline journalists in 77 countries. They found the following, and I have no reason to believe that we are any different. So, one, nearly every freelance journalist has lost revenue or work opportunities. More than half of all journalists are suffering from stress and anxiety. More than a quarter lack essential equipment to enable them to work safely from home, while 1 in 4 lack protective equipment to work in the field. Dozens of journalists abroad have been arrested, face lawsuits, and here too, or assaulted. And as you know, there were quite a few journalists who were laid off last year during the pandemic. And then more than a third of journalists have shifted their focus to covering COVID-19 related stories, so that if there are journalists who were, normally covering the political arena or social, various social ills, or oil and gas, or, everybody is now covering COVID. So there's lots and lots of challenges, but I would say to you, and then, the biggest one also is the easy transmission of misinformation, right? As you know that there's a clear difference between contending points of view and misinformation. And I would say that in Trinidad and Tobago, we've done a good job between contending points of view and misinformation. And in general, despite all these challenges, I would have to say that the media in Trinidad and Tobago is extremely robust. And, that really speaks to the fact that journalism is a vocation. So many of my colleagues have, sadly, they've died, kind of poor, and they've died alone and ill, quite a few of them. And so nobody is in here for the fame or the money. And I think people in journalism genuinely want to do their jobs on behalf of the people.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you on that. And I want to ask you a question, but we'll break for commercials. And when we come back, I'll ask you to answer it. I've been talking with you about this, and these things have been on my mind for months now, since the emergence of COVID, and I've been looking at the media and so on. And of course, since I myself am now immersed in it because of this program, there was a professor of journalism at NYU who I was surprised to see him on CNN yesterday. His name is Jay Rosen. He is a very well-known name. He's received a lot of awards and so on. And many years ago, during the 1990s, he wrote a book, actually, asking what are journalists for, basically questioning not questioning, but speaking to the value of journalists and journalism in a society. And yesterday he was arguing the case that journalists now need to make a kind of declaration for democracy, because he's talking, of course, in the American situation, because democracy is under threat everywhere, in the United States as well, since the emergence of all of this misinformation, the Trump phenomenon, etc. And therefore, journalists need to kind of reassess what journalism is about and what is the standard they take in this society. So I will leave you with that for a minute, and when we come back, we'll talk about it. So this is Brighter Morning with Bo. We are talking to Ira Mathur, the head of MAT, president of MAT Media Association of Trinidad and Tobago, about journalism, the media, and the press. And we will, when we come back, we continue the discussion. This is Brighter Morning with Bo on MCTV, and I am Bo Tiwari.
Welcome to Lifetime Solutions, where you can trust your roof to us. Our services include custom fabrication, steel framing, roofing installation, on-site roll forming, roofing maintenance and services. Call 223-ROOF or 223-7663 for a quote today, or visit our website www.lifetimesolutionst.com. Lifetime Solutions. You can trust your roof to us. Call 223-ROOF or 223-7663 for a quote today, or visit our website www.lifetimesolutionstt.com.
As businesses adapt to the new normal, let Magic Mist take care of your cleaning and sanitization needs with our COVID-19 BSCAI internationally certified technicians. With over 43 years of protecting the health of our nation, you can trust us to ensure your building remains safe, healthy, and functional. Give us a call today at 638-6675 or 332-5522. Magic Mist Services Limited, your total facilities management solutions provider.
This is Brighter Morning with Bo. I'm Bo Tiwari, and we're talking to the president of MAT, Ira Mathur, this morning. And we have we posed a question earlier, and we are going to ask her to respond to that. And it really has to do with the changing nature of journalism in a context in which the Trump phenomenon is a factor in the United States and in the world system. You have direct attacks on democracy through misinformation strategies on the media. On other media, that's to say the social media, and you have, basically developments that did not exist, let's say 20 years ago, in the national system or in the world system. And we're dealing with a changing phenomenon here. So I'm asking Ira to respond to that.
I think the hugest challenge that journalists face today is the easy transmission of misinformation, as you were saying, Bo. And because social media has become such a huge influencer. I mean, people are now looking to social media for guidance on, for instance, on whether they should take the vaccine or not, which is also a huge issue globally, because even as now, millions die, that guides a lot of people. So whereas when I began as a journalist, there would be there would be a couple of live broadcasts and a few newspapers and some radio stations and some periodicals that we all trusted, where we went for our information. Now everybody has that kind of information, and people, and this ties into my earlier point, is that people are not always clear on what is it that a journalist, what differentiates a journalist information or a journalist column from a column that appears, say, on Facebook. So we have to work much harder to ensure that our standards are all the way up there and make that demarcation. Because, as you know, Bo, there is a clear difference between contending points of view and misinformation. Trinidad and Tobago, we've done a good job between contending points of view and misinformation. So we cannot say people who believe in vaccines and people who don't. A lot of people, those who are questioning the vaccines are not in general, I'm saying in general, coming through the World Health Organization. They're not coming from trusted sources. So that is the way that we can hold our ground in this, what I would say, it's a quicksand, it's a quagmire. And the other way that we can hold our own is that as journalists in Trinidad and Tobago, we're probably about 15 to 20 years behind the information age, and we need to catch up very quickly. That is why that's part of the mandate of this MAT that we are now, the new executive, is that we want to bring MAT into the digital age. And a lot of our journalists are already there. A few of them, I would say not a lot, are already there. And we understand, we all understand that we all have to get to the digital age so that we get onto the same platforms where misinformation is taking place, where people, which are the most used platforms, and correct that misinformation, and also establish ourselves as the most credible types of news. Again, you spoke about the Trump situation. Now, also remember, because the US is that much bigger and you have huge organizations like Fox News that wholly buy into an entire ideology of Trump and kind of further that perspective, we don't have that here. So in a way, it's a good thing and a bad thing. But once again, I want to say that COVID or no COVID, our journalists are committed to being truthful and fearless mirrors to society. And, I'm continually amazed when I think about some of the conditions that journalists work under. I mean, I've had calls from my Sunday editor at 2 a.m. to check something from my story. So she's working from home. She's having those challenges from home, but she's calling me. So I'm continually amazed by how our media continue to work doggedly through it all. And, recently, for instance, there was a fire at Express House. Engineers did work all night, but the following day, despite the smoke, the journalists were back on the job. And that's the only way that we can continue our work, by just doing it doggedly and also joining the platforms that promote misinformation.
Yeah, well, you're going into a new era, area there, which I would really like to explore. We don't have time today because we've got a break for the news. But I want to thank you for being on the program and being so forthright in your views about what is happening to journalism, the challenges it has faced, how it has lived up to its responsibilities and obligations, and more than that, where you are likely to be headed. I want to thank you very much and to wish MAT all the best. MAT is an important institution. The media are very important. The press freedom and the independence of journalists are also very, very important. And we really need a free press, a free media, in order to have democracy in Trinidad and Tobago and the region. Thank you very much for being with me. This is Brighter Morning with Bo, and we break now for Andrew Chan and the 7 o'clock news.